Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, it began with a wave of jubilation. Rigid Arab regimes in Tunisia and Egypt crumbling in short order in the face of mass street protests. Now after a 6-month struggle, the all but certain fall of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya has provided a much-needed boost to protesters across the Arab world, even as it showed that not all uprisings are created equal. Now, from Yemen to Bahrain to Syria, we are seeing popular revolts remaining very much works in progress with very uncertain outcomes. Now, my guest today, Peter Hartling, is a project director for Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, those 3 countries, with the International Crisis Group. And if you're not familiar with it, the ICG is a nonprofit, independent organization, correct me if I'm wrong, that advises governments and world bodies on how to prevent and hopefully resolve deadly conflicts around the world. Yeah. It's a long explanation, but I think that sort of reflects it. Interestingly, you are based in the Syrian capital, Damascus. You've been there for, what, 4 or 5 years now? You were recently there. I have to start by asking you, you're one of the few, Westerners that's really seen things up close. How would you describe the situation in the capital itself? Is there a sense of tension? How is everyday life there?
Well, it's been very tense and harrowing, in fact, for most inhabitants of Damascus over the past few months. But progressively, people are settling into this crisis, into this new Syria. Syria has changed dramatically as a result of the crisis, and I find that people are very slowly adjusting one way or the other. And I find the society in Damascus now is very much split between people who are radicalized in their opposition to the regime and people who fear almost hysterically at times any alternative.
Have you been able to travel outside of Damascus, or have you pretty much been not confined, but have you chosen to stay in the capital?
Well, it's very hard to travel across Syria in these circumstances. So it's a matter of talking to people coming back from regions or cities that they hail from. And a lot of information that can be garnered, is that way. And I think it's one of the big problems is that very little information can be confirmed about what's going on in detail in any part of the country.
They haven't really let journalists in at all.
Exactly, and obviously the regime's own narrative is extremely unreliable and more repetitive, referring exclusively to what the regime would like to see as an armed Islamist or terrorist insurgency. Well,
the media coverage obviously has been based predominantly on grainy videos that have been taken by people who post them on social networks. How is the Bashar Assad regime, how have they sort of used the Western media coverage, if at all? Have they sort of called it propaganda? What has their reaction been from where you stand?
Well, as a whole, they do describe the Western coverage of the crisis, or the Arab coverage of the crisis for that matter, as propaganda, as a media war against the regime. And many mistakes indeed have been made for lack of access to the ground. Some reporting, for example, focused on the shelling of neighborhoods in Homs, in Hama, or the use of the Navy, for example, to bomb the coastal city of Ladqi. It's unclear to this day exactly what happened and to what extent the military were used in those
Unclear,
operations.
sure, but ICG, I'm sure you would agree with the reports from the human rights groups which say that at least 2,000, some people say 2,200 people have died since the uprising began in Syria, and countless others have either disappeared or been detained.
Well, my guess would be that many more indeed have fallen victim to this crisis. Those numbers correspond to individuals that could be clearly identified as victims, as casualties. So I think there are a number of disappeared, for example, which remain unaccounted for.
You co-authored a piece recently in which, on the Syrian regime, in which you said essentially that Bashar al-Assad is digging his own grave right now through some of his policies. And I would assume you were referring to the fact he has been intensifying, it almost seems, his crackdown, even as in the face of mounting international condemnation and sanctions.
Well, I think at every stage of this crisis, which has been through multiple stages, the regime behaved in a way which made things worse. That was very true in the early stages when the regime was in total denial, rejected the notion that this was a very deep national crisis. And it's a huge waste because I think initially the regime was well poised to actually deal with the crisis in a constructive way.
Do you believe that Assad, I mean, the early line in all of this was that he was the reformer. People had placed great hopes in him that he really would reform the country. Aren't we just seeing perhaps the real Bashar al-Assad now? He never was the reformer?
Well, whether we're seeing the real Bashar, I know I'm not sure there ever was a real Bashar, but I'm pretty sure that he is being transformed by this crisis into someone who is definitely more cynical and ruthless than he was in the early stages. That was true of his father, too.
He's becoming his father, right?
His father, when
worse.
he took power, was perceived very much as Bashar was perceived in the early stages of his rule, as someone relatively modern, open to change, a reformist, so to speak. He was deeply transformed into a very paranoid leader as a result of the crisis that opposed the regime to the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 70s and early 80s. This dynamic could very much be at play today in Syria with his son.
With Gaddafi, as I said at the beginning of this show, with Gaddafi, if not captured yet, at least removed from power, it seems that Assad's position is very much fragilized, much more in jeopardy than it was even yesterday or 2 days ago. Do you think he senses this? Do you think he feels that pressure mounting, that his days are numbered?
Well, he gave, incidentally, he gave a lecture or an interview, so to speak, on Syrian television precisely at the moment when the Libyan regime was collapsing. And he gave no clear indication that he realized in what dangerous situation he finds himself. Now, what's striking with these regimes as a whole is that they prove to be extremely resilient until the very moment they collapse.
Until they're not.
Exactly.
Right.
That was true of the Iraqi regime in 2003. So it's very different from other historical cases, such as Nazi Germany, for example, where the downfall lasted for a couple of years.
You think this will be abrupt?
So it could very much be abrupt in Syria as elsewhere, and I think that's where the Libyan case sets yet again a precedent which is relevant to protesters in Syria. They realize that it's possible to bring these crises to an end and to precipitate the collapse of these regimes.
And at this point right now, we've seen sanctions. We haven't seen a UN-style resolution for a military intervention, as we saw in Libya with Syria. What should the international community do at this point?
Well, there are many debates ongoing within our governments at this stage to determine what to do. And I think there's the pressure building up to do something. And I think that's rather dangerous in itself. We should not do something simply for the sake of doing something, but really by weighing the options. And I think a word has to be said about sanctions, which could play into the regime's hands.
Isn't he laughing at sanctions? I mean, does he really care about the sanctions? Wouldn't they have worked by now if they were going to?
Well, the sanctions have been targeted and focused on specific individuals and have amounted essentially to travel bans and asset freezes. What's being discussed right now are sanctions that would hit the economy, that would focus on the oil and gas sector, which obviously are key to the regime's ability to pay salaries and to sustain itself. But very quickly we could see an impact on society. And here the risk is enabling the regime to substantiate the notion that there is an international conspiracy, not focused on the regime, but actually aiming at harming Syria as a society.
Does he believe his own lines, Bashar al-Assad, when he says, we're protecting the Syrian people from criminal gangs, Islamic insurgents, that global conspiracy you speak of? Does he really believe that?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, what he believes or not. I think there's a lot of disinformation going on within the regime.
So he's being given bad information.
Well, I think by now he's had a chance, assuming he made the effort, to get a clear understanding of what's going on the ground. And it is essentially non-violent, a peaceful protest movement, with obviously some incidents occurring here and there which are being systematically played up by the regime. And in fact, the regime has been attempting in a very systematic way to create incidents as a way of supporting its own
I guess we've seen
narrative.
that in other conflicts as well. In the little time we have left, we've spoken a lot, or at least specialist pundits like myself, we've said, well, if Syria were to go, if Assad were to go, that would open the floodgates of instability across the region, which is why we haven't seen the same military intervention that we saw in Libya, in the case of Libya. Do you believe that? And don't you believe at this point that perhaps Assad staying in power would lead to more instability than if he were to go?
Well, that's one of the ironies of this crisis. Many of the most hostile governments to the regime, in fact, wanted the regime to do a better job at handling the crisis for that reason. Because they fear the alternative. Now they've moved on, I think, in Israel, in the US, in Saudi Arabia. There's a much tougher stance vis-à-vis the regime, and they would like to see it collapse. But it took them 5 months or 4 months to get there. Now, in terms of my own assessment, I think we're in a situation in the region where none of these preconceived ideas really hold. I think we have to accept that it's a very volatile situation, and we have to adjust to it.
So it's not just a line. There's a lot of potential for volatility, instability. We have to wrap it up.
There is potential for very daunting scenarios in Syria. There's potential also for enthusing ones. What we see coming out from Syrian society for the time being is extremely encouraging. We do see a measure of sectarianism. We do see some violence, which is contained to a large extent, but we also see an unprecedented sense of national unity, dedication to the country.
We're going to have to leave it on that encouraging note, on the optimistic note. Peter Hartling with the International Crisis Group monitoring the situation in Syria. You live in Damascus, and we've been discussing today really whether or not Assad's days are numbered after the near fall of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of you for watching. And of course, you could follow all the latest on the Arab uprisings on our website at www.france24.com. Thanks for watching.